porque he sonado sin micro lo mismo, creo. Te doy más 10. ¿Tiene cultura baikal?
More than 30% of the population of Europe about a century before the time that we are talking about. But there are several recurrences, and the last one was exactly in 1665 and 1666, and it was known as the Great Plague of London. So as you can imagine, these are not the perfect conditions to perform scientific research and scientific work. But maybe the most important obstacle be for Willis and all the scientists of this period was the Galenic doctrine in medicine and anatomy. Galen, also known as Galen of Pergamon, was born in 129. He was a prominent Greek physician, surgeon, and philosopher. He acquired his initial experience as surgeon by treating the gladiators. As you can imagine, this is a very good possibility to acquire a good experience for a very short period of time. He made fundamental concepts in medicine and philosophy, and became one of the most prominent scientists of his time. His work was so fundamental and so important that in fact he influenced Western medical science for more than 1,300 years. Not 13, not 130, but 1,300 years. So, as you may imagine, this is a very strong tradition that was not easy to fight, because what was the problem with the concept of Galen? The problem was that a part of his notion for our body were wrong from our contemporary point of view. I will give you some of them. Galen taught that the cardiovascular system consists of two completely separate one-way systems of distribution. One of them was the venous system, and the venous blood was generated in the liver. The other, the completely separate arterial blood, was originating in the heart, and they are going in a forth and back way from the heart in an ebb and flow motion. So every scientist, every physician from this 1,300 years, if you ask any one of them, anyone who told you that this is the way that our body was functioning, this is the way that our heart is functioning. You can imagine that this was the notion, a concept that was completely accepted by all of the scientists during this long period. The thing has started to change in 1213 by an Arab physician, Ibn al-Nafis, who was born in Damascus and published a book, Commentary on Anatomy in Avicenna's Canon. In this book, he described the following: the blood from the right chamber must flow through the vena arteriosa, actually known as the pulmonary artery, to the lung, spread to its substance, pass through the arteria venosa, actually known as pulmonary vein, and reach the left chamber of the heart. In fact, this was the first description of the pulmonary circulation. This was one of the first breakthrough to the concept of Galen. Later, we have the anatomical drawings of Leonardo that are giving also a new concept of how our body is functioning. And the work of Andreas Vesalius, the structure of human body, that was so important, so different from all the actual concepts, that in fact Andreas Vesalius has become the father of the contemporary anatomy. It's very important to mention William Harvey. He was the first physician that, we may say, made a revolution in the way that we are understanding how our circulating, our body is functioning, and how our system, cardiovascular system, is functioning. In fact, he was the first to completely change the concepts and to tell that the heart works as a pump, that the arterial and the blood and the venous blood are circulating in a circular way. So the heart, what we know actually as a notion, that our heart works as a pump, that the blood does not drift in the body in any sort of random ebb and flow, but is pumped endlessly around a very precise circuit. This concept was so different and so important that we may compare it with the discovery of the DNA. So the circle of Willis before Willis was mentioned several times by different investigators. We have to mention described part of this circle. Giulio Cesario, that illustrated the circle of Willis, but not completely. Jan Wessling, that also made investigation regarding this circle, and Jan Weffer, that in his book published in 1658, clearly described in details the whole circle, but failed to make a good quality illustration of this finding. So what were the key points of the success of Willis for his discovery? On the first place, this was a dissection method and the dissection skills. Previous anatomists approached the brain by dissecting it in situ. They opened the cranial vault and make a dissection in situ, And as you can imagine, these do not give you a good access to the basal anatomical structures. Willis and a group of his co-workers tried a completely different way. They removed the brain as a whole from the cranial cavity and dissected it apart. So this, of course, gave them an important advantage. The second key point are the illustrating skills. All the marvelous illustration in his book was made by Christopher Wren. By the way, Christopher Wren is one of the very important figure in the architecture of England, and in fact he is the most highly acclaimed English architect in the history. He is accorded to be responsible for the rebuilding of 52 churches in the city of London, amongst which the St. Paul's Cathedral. So he was a very prominent architect, and but before becoming such a prominent architect, he worked with Willis as a collaborator and made a wonderful illustration of his anatomical studies. And the third important key point for the success of Willis is the discovery of the intravenous injection. In 1650, Christopher Wren, that I just mentioned, with Richard Lower, invented the intravenous injection. You can imagine how important was this for the whole medicine. This was a completely new and different concept. For us, intravenous injection is something that we see every day, but for the time that we are discussing, this was a small revolution. So they discovered the intravenous infusion. By the way, Richard Lower will later made the first blood transfusion from a sheep to a dog initially, after that from a sheep to a man, by the way, with good initial results. So this method of infusion was used for the injection of ink in the venous system of a dog, and this gives a completely new way of a completely new view of the communication between the blood vessels that was extremely important. Finally, this method was similar of the principle that will predate the radiological angiography. You can imagine how important is that. So, if you have to reiterate, Thomas Willis was the first to describe the circle and to present the first realistic, high-quality illustration of it. What is even probably more important is that he was the first to recognize the physiological significance and importance of the circle in the maintenance of the collateral flow of the brain. He never thought that this circle is his circle. It's not then only, it's about 100 years later that Albertus von Haller in his Bibliotheca Anatomica was first to attach the name of Willis to this circle. Subsequently, circle of Willis has gained a popularity and became a commonly used eponymous name. Regarding the study of the circle of Willis, the next step was the cerebral angiography. The Portuguese neurologist Antonio Egas Moniz was one of the founder of the modern psychoneurosurgery. He introduced in the neurosurgical practice the leucotomy, also known as lobotomy in some situations. For this invention, he received a Nobel Prize in 1949. This was quite contradictory because his great invention, in fact, was the cerebral angiography. You can imagine the importance of the cerebral angiography for studying the brain in a period of time when the only way to study the brain was the pneumoencephalography. This was the only method for acquiring additional information about the brain, image information. So he developed the cerebral angiography, and this gave completely new view of the circle of Willis. Next step in the study of the circle of Willis was the development of the neuroembryology. We have to mention the names of Raimon y Cajal, the work of Hiss and Kupfer, and also of Streeter. But probably the most important regarding the circle of Willis work was made by Dorcas Paget. She published in 1945 two landmark papers. The first one was the different cranial arteries in the human embryo, and the second was the circle of Willis, biology and anatomy. By this study, we acquired a new knowledge about the development of the circle of Willis. And here you can find on this scheme a human embryo in different stages of development. I will not go in details, but as you may see, at day 44, we already have a well-developed circle of Willis. So this means in early stages of development. The next step of investigation of the circle of Willis and the brain as a whole was made by Professor Yaşargil. He was from Turkish origin, but most of his study was performed in Switzerland. Modern microneurosurgery gave a new concept for gaining access to different structures of the brain by the arachnoid neurons, made very important anatomical, microanatomical study, and in fact, he is the father of the contemporary microneurosurgery. The whole neurosurgical society agreed that he was chosen for the most important neurosurgeon for the second half of the 20th century. Here I will show you some examples of microanatomical studies that we performed in our hospital and that are dedicated to the better knowledge of details of the anatomy of the circle of Willis and mainly of the posterior part of the circle of Willis. We used a method with red-colored latex that was injected in the vessels of the brain, and we made dissection, microdissection, under optical magnification of 6 to 40 times. So we use, this is the circle of Willis in a standard specimen of our study. We used also standard nomenclature, anterior perforating branches and posterior for this that emerged from the P1 segment. We studied also the zone of penetration of all the perforating branches. We divided all the group in 3, depending on the communicating posterior. The normal situation, the adult type, was when the communicate posterior artery was more than 1 millimeter in diameter and is smaller than the P1 segment of the posterior cerebral artery. We have hypoplasty when we have a smaller communicating posterior artery than 1 millimeter, and a fetal type when the communicating posterior artery is larger than the P1 segment. We made a lot of studies in details. Here you can find the bilateral hypoplastic communicating posterior arteries. This is an example for a fetal type. You can see that the diameter of the posterior communicating artery is much larger than the diameter of the P1 segment of the posterior cerebral artery. This is an example of bilateral fetal type, as you can see on one side, and on the other side, the posterior communicating artery have larger diameter than the P1 segment of the posterior cerebral artery. These are different anatomical variations, and I don't want to go in details with the numbers, but what is important that for these 3 types of posterior communicating artery, adult, hypoplastic, and fetal type, there was a very similar number of perforating branches, and the pattern of distribution of these branches was also similar for these 3 groups. So as you may see, even in a hypoplastic posterior communicating artery, we have a large number of perforating branches that are emerging. So our conclusion was the hypoplastic posterior communicating artery tend to be slightly longer and with a distinct reduction of the diameter from the anterior to the posterior third than the adult type of posterior communicating artery. So the main importance of this conclusion was that during surgery you can make a section of the posterior communicating artery if you preserve the perforating vessels But even in cases of hypoplastic posterior communicating artery, you have to be very careful because obviously, despite the hypoplasty, functionally this artery is important. This study was published in Acta Neurochirurgica about more than 10 years ago. What is strange that during that period, this conclusion was important mainly when dealing with, when operating aneurysm of the basilar tip. Actually, this surgery is not performed very frequently, so this conclusion is important only in situation in neuro-oncology when we try to gain wider exposure of the cranial base and we have to section this artery. We made also a study of the premammillary artery. I don't want to go in details, but this is the largest and most important perforating branches emerging from the posterior communicating artery. Usually there are one premammillary artery, but in about 25% there are two or even three. The premammillary artery is emerging mainly in the middle third of the posterior communicating artery, but there are some interesting anatomical variations when you can find it emerging from the internal carotid artery or from the P2 segment of the posterior cerebral artery. As you can see, the reduction of the diameter of the posterior communicating artery usually appear after the emergence of this branch, this important branch, this important perforating vessel. This is another example. With the asterisk, you can see the premammillary artery. Another example. This is the premammillary artery. There are some cases where the posterior communicating artery, we may say that exists just to give this branch that is the premammillary artery. As you may see, of the posterior communicating artery is a very thin branch, almost inexisting branch. So this is an interesting variation that has not been described in the literature until this study. This is an interesting case of emergence of the premammillary artery from the internal carotid artery. And in this situation, we may find the emergence of the premammillary artery from the P2 segment of the posterior cerebral artery. Another example of the same anatomical variation. This is an endoscopic view of the posterior communicating artery and the premammillary artery. In fact, this is another way to study the brain with neuroendoscopy, because this gives you the possibility to have a look around the corner and to see structures that you cannot see with the operative microscope. So the conclusions for this was published some years ago, also in Acta Neurochirurgica. We made study of the P1 segment that you may see. We learned how is the branching pattern of all the perforators, and the important conclusions that we have made from this study is that the P1 segment, even when it's hypoplastic, may give an important perforating, may give beginning of the important perforating branches that have to be spared during surgery or endovascular procedure, and that usually the first perforators emerge about 1 millimeter distal to the bifurcation of the basilar artery. So these are different anatomical variations and infundibular dilatations of the unilateral or bilateral of the posterior communicating artery that are also interesting as a part of the anatomical variation of the circle of Willis. So regarding our knowledge about the circle of Willis, next step has been made with the CT and MRI angiography, because they give us the possibility to study this the circulation with a non-invasive method. And of course, we have to mention the mathematical modeling that is quite complex for me to explain it. But this exists as a method for investigating the circulation through the circle of Willis. Last but not least, we have to tell that actually in the era of neuroendovascular procedure, the circle of Willis become more and more important from a different point of view as a collateral access for endovascular procedures. There are a lot of recent publications that are describing the use of different approaches by the collateral circulation to different parts of the brain. And I think that this is important as a contemporary view on this circle. So this was a long history, starting with Galen, by passing to William Harvey and discovery how our cardiovascular system work, by Thomas Willis, neurobiology, Egas Moniz, and actually we may say that for the circle of Willis we know first that this is the most common place for aneurysmal formation. This is an important collateral flow for the brain. The circle of Willis is important in the reduction of the hemodynamic stress of the arteries of the brain. The perforating vessels of the circle of Willis have to be preserved during surgery, and this is very important for the good result. Some part of the circle of Willis may be sacrificed during surgery if the collateral flow and the perforating vessels are preserved. The circle of Willis can be an important alternative for access during endovascular procedure, and the mathematical modeling and the non-invasive imaging studies will be the basis for our future understanding of the circle of Willis. What we're gonna discover, if we're gonna discover some new, interesting, even revolutionary thing of the circle of Willis, is a question that we'll have the answer in the future. But actually, we have had a long way in our understanding, and I think that this is one of the important discoveries that we may be proud of. Thank you for your attention.
Are there any questions? Thank you, Doctor, for your lecture.